From Auckland, we had a 5-hour flight to Cairns. With a full dinner and bar, we arrived full and a bit sleepy. We caught a taxi to the hostel, the Calypso. The place was rocking with young people all around, and the bar was in full swing. We were up bright and early Monday morning to experience Cairns in a day. We were picked up at the hostel and taken to the railroad depot for an hour-long scenic train ride up to Corunna. We listened to commentary describing the history of the area and the train line as we passed some amazing views. The train wound around Horseshoe Bend, and we were able to get a glimpse for the first time of just how long the train was. We passed Stony Creek Falls, where the train slowed down for all to get a good look at the falls. Then we stopped at Barron Gorge and Falls and were able to get out and really experience the area.
We finished the train ride at the Corunna Village and Markets. The markets offer great local arts and crafts, as well as wonderful cafes for lunch or a quick snack. We had a great time, but unfortunately only had an hour to spend. We could have easily spent a whole day there. Corunna had a lot to offer. But unfortunately we had to catch the Skyrail Rainforest Cableway back down to Cairns. Though we were sad to leave Corunna so quickly, we loved the trip on the Skyrail Cableway, where we sailed 4.5 miles over the top of the World Heritage Area Daintree Rainforest. We stopped at a couple of places along the way. The first was the Barron Falls Station in the Barron Gorge National Park. We saw the Barron Falls again from a different angle and also saw the train that had brought us up to Corunna. We then continued to the Red Peak Station, where we took a walk along the boardwalk and learned about different rainforest plants and the rarely seen southern cassowary. We then descended the rest of the way back to Cairns' beautiful coastline.
From there, we changed gears from the lush tropical rainforest to the crystal clear waters of the Great Barrier Reef. Our driver transported us to Down Under helicopters. Our pilot gave us a quick safety briefing and had us put on life jackets, and off we went. We boarded a 4-seat helicopter for a 30-minute ride over the Great Barrier Reef to our waiting boat, the Osprey 5, at Hastings Reef. We landed on a heli pontoon and were taken by dinghy to the main boat. Knowing that we were going to be diving the reef for a week, we were planning on taking the submersible glass-bottom boat as opposed to snorkeling. But that wasn't an option since it had been taken out by Cyclone Larry. So instead, we had a big lunch and got ready to go snorkeling for a couple hours. Because of all the people in the water, there wasn't a great deal of marine life around, but what was there was very cool. Once done, we had an hour-and-a-half boat trip back to the dock and enjoyed some wine and cheese to end the trip. Then back to the Calypso and again found the place starting to gear up for another night of partying.
The next morning, our driver picked us up promptly at 7 o'clock a.m. and we were on our way to the Undara Volcanic National Park in the Outback. After a 4-hour trip, we arrived in Undara. They checked us in and gave us a rundown of our itinerary. We went into our rooms and I had a huge permagrin on my face. They were old railway cars from the mid to late 1800s, and they had done an excellent job in restoring them. We had a whole car to ourselves, which consisted of a spacious bed, 2 fans which served as air conditioning, and a row of bench seating which served as a partition for a changing area. We went to the reception area and checked ourselves out for a self-guided walk through the Outback. Everyone's warnings about the dangerous poisonous animals in Australia came back to me as we headed out on the trail. I walked through the trail like a man in a minefield. I saw many holes in the ground which I assumed contained poisonous snakes waiting for me to step close so they could grab me. The scenery in the Outback was spectacular. It was referred to as a savanna with trees and grass scattered throughout the rocky, sandy soil. We went to Atkinson's Lookout and were rewarded with a beautiful overlook across the Outback. We headed back and found the pool, but we unfortunately didn't bring our suits, so we just soaked our feet in the water.
In the evening, we went with our guide Chris for an evening tour of the Outback and lava tubes. We saw a ton of wildlife along the trip. We saw many kangaroos and wallabies.
He's always being challenged by the younger members, and there's always a punch-up somewhere. So that's his lifestyle. As you can imagine, that's a pretty hard life. The dominant male is only at the top for maybe 1 to 2 years.
We also came across 2 fringe-necked lizards and watched them run from the minibus. We were so enthralled with all the wildlife we almost were too late getting to the overlook to watch the sunset. It was a short hike to the top of the bluff, and we ran while Chris unpacked and carried up the champagne and cheese for us to enjoy as we watched. There were only 4 of us, and it was beautiful with lots of purples and reds. We then rode out to Barker's lava tubes to watch the bats come out for their nightly feeding. We got back on the later side, but luckily they were still serving dinner. After dinner, we caught part of Chris's slideshow on animals of the outback. Then we went to view the stars, which were really brilliant. The conditions were so perfect that the Milky Way was clearly defined and the Southern Cross was also very evident. We went to bed very happy and excited to be sleeping in relative safety in the outback.
The next morning started off with breakfast, Outback style. Baked beans, fried eggs, bacon, hash browns, cereal, strong coffee, and of course, Vegemite. We ate outdoors and there was plenty of everything. Then we went back to the room and showered. We gathered with the day group for a morning tour of the lava tubes, with Chris as our guide again. Before we got to the first lava tube, we spotted 2 emus, which are quite rare to see. The guide had said he'd only seen 1 emu a handful of times and never 2 together. The lava tubes were huge, formed from an underground flowing lava that cooled and left spacious rooms. Much of them were in layers of silt, and you couldn't go in very deep through them.
We went back for a quick lunch and one last hike before our bus trip back to Cairns. We were rewarded with mobs of kangaroos on the hike back. We watched them for a while before we went back to wait for the bus. We spent the rest of the afternoon by the pool and talked about all the information we had gathered, and how beautiful all the scenery was. We both agreed that this was one of the highlights of the trip thus far.
The next morning, the plan was to rent a car and drive to Cape Tribulation. We drove up, took the ferry across the Daintree River, and made our way to the Cape Tribulation campground. We stopped at an info site next to the Cape Tribulation campground. The woman there told us that due to the rain and lack of tourists, many of the things we wanted to do, such as guided night bushwalk, 4-wheel drive safari, crocodile walks, etc., had been canceled. She also confirmed that the increasing waters may indeed prevent us from leaving, especially because the streams were influenced by the tides. The rain continued to pour down, and we decided that due to the lack of things to do and the rising waters that we would cut our stay short.
The campground was right next to the beach. It could only be reached during low tide, but luckily the morning allowed a quick hike there. I got up early to check it out, but didn't get a good sunrise because of the rain. I did, however, almost run into one of the biggest spider webs and spiders I had ever seen, the golden orb spider. After that, we had cereal for breakfast and were picked up for our day of horseback riding. Our guide was a former jockey and assigned us horses based on weight and riding ability. We were joined by 2 Japanese women who were quite nice but spoke very little English. The saddles were English style, and controlling the horses was different from any other riding we had done. It was a pleasant ride, and the rain pretty much held off the entire time. We had lunch at PK's and then went to the Bat House, where we met Old Boy, one of the resident flying foxes. He was really quite interesting to watch as he played in his small play area.
We then headed to the Daintree Discovery Center. It had an elevated walkway through the rainforest. Electronic guides provided information as we walked. There wasn't a lot of animal activity because of the weather, but we enjoyed looking at the huge trees and the diverse plant life throughout the forest. We finished the self-guided tour right when they were closing, spending all afternoon in the rainforest and wishing we had more time. On the way back to Port Douglas, we stopped for a beautiful double rainbow, and then at Mossman's Gorge right before the sun went down. We only had time for a quick hike, but it was nice. We checked into Dougie's Backpackers and had dinner at a local restaurant. The evening finished off with us doing laundry and prepping our gear for the upcoming week on the liveaboard.
The next morning we waited for the bus to take us to Hartley's Crocodile Farm, a can't miss recommended by many people. We first went to the crocodile farm where they raise male crocs for their hides and meat. We got to touch one of the baby crocs and found that their skin was surprisingly quite smooth. From there we went to a snake show, and then went on a boat ride where we watched them attract and feed the crocs. It was pretty dramatic stuff. with the sound of jaws being very loud and the boat driver gleefully telling us how they can easily crush a feral pig's head. From there we watched the crocodile show, the highlight of Hartley's. The handler worked with a large croc named Bart.
Now, hopefully what we're going to get ready for now is showing you exactly how crocodiles attack. And he's very, very good at that. He's going to come sneaking up on me, yeah? And then it's like he's doing now. And then it gets to some stage, he will come bursting out of the water and try and bite me. Okay, well, that's what croc attack's all about, isn't it? He sneaks up, out of the water, bite. That is as simple as croc attack gets, okay? That's as complicated as it gets as well, okay? So, now, feeding techniques that we hope you're going to demonstrate with him are going to be the ever crowd-pleasing death rolling. Yeah, you've probably heard about that. Let's just call it a crocodile roll, or simply a pre-digestive feeding technique. Yeah, we'll find out in a second, won't we? Ah, yes. Oh, you come on, come on. You going to come all the way? Cool. You going to sit? You going to stay there? Why do you always have to come up and be here with me? Okay, you're just going to chill out. Okay, look guys, we've got Bart out of the water. That's his name, Bart. Okay? Now, I guess you can call him whatever you want to call him, because he doesn't respond to name calling. Excellent. You want to have a play, do you? You going to have a play? Cool. Now, just go for a swim, buddy, would be really good. I love it when he follows the script. All the way up, buddy. Come on, all the way up. All the way. Come on, don't be shy. Good boy. It's a little bit like walking around with a large, unpredictable dog, really, isn't it? You're still hanging on to that? Good. You going to do me a roll? You going to do me a roll or a head shake? How about just a roll would be pretty cool. Another roll. Oh, head shake, that's even better. I'm going to get over this side of you though. Don't you swallow that. Hey.
We then walked through the crocodile section on the way to the cassowary feeding show, where we were able to personally feed this very rare bird. And then it was koala feeding time.
Say a lot of people want to come to Australia and the first thing they want to spot in the trees are one of these guys. Unfortunately, it's probably not that easy. A lot of locals themselves probably haven't seen a koala in the wild. Obviously, if you're in the right spot and you're going out with a guide, it's a little bit easier and you've got a better chance of seeing one of these guys, but they are quite unique.
Hartley's was a place that we could have easily spent an entire day.
We arrived at the check-in a little late. We got an overview of the trip and met our crew. John, our captain and underwater photographer, Monique, dive master and backup skipper, Carl, marine biologist and entertainer, Richard, shark wrangler, researcher, backup skipper, Yop, engineer and shark wrangler, Emily, chef supreme, and Martin, cabin boy for lack of a better word. We quickly fell into the routine for the next 6 days. Early morning rise of about 6:30 to have a light breakfast of cereal and fruit. We were usually one of the first up, so we got to hear Monique shout, "Wakey, wakey," or "Time for breaky." Then we had our morning dive brief. Sometimes a drift dive, other times an anchored dive. Then it was into the water to see all the cool stuff. Then an inventory of several key creatures that were used to determine the health of the reef. After getting out, checking in, and drying off, it was time for a proper breakfast. Bacon, eggs, French toast. Each morning was different. Then it was either time for a nap, or lounging out on the deck, or learning something very cool. Next was another dive brief, dive, and inventory. Then lunch. Afterwards, nap or talks on marine life. Then another dive brief, dive, inventory, then rest and relax. Then another dive brief, night dive, inventory. Then full dinner. Afterwards, drinks, movie, or more marine life presentations. Then sleep. In summary, eat, dive, eat, learn, sleep, dive, eat, learn, sleep, dive, learn, sleep, dive, eat, drink, sleep.
We started and ended our trip on the Ribbon Reefs. Characteristics of the Ribbon Reefs are lush coral gardens and many spectacular pinnacles and bommies, or coral mountains, surrounded by schooling fish. And there are heaps of other marine creatures around. The variety of life is most stunning and produces a very colorful picture.
We started our diving in Ribbon Reef number 10, Pixie Gardens and Pinnacle. The gardens were a nice introduction to the reef, with lots of pretty coral and interesting fish, including the diagonally banded sweet lips, which was one of the key inventory species used to determine the reef's health. It also featured garden eels and a moray eel.
Then we headed north to the famous Cod Hole, featuring the giant potato and flowery cods. These huge cods, measuring up to 10 feet, came in really close. Also joining us were several giant Maori wrasse. Equally as impressive, these giants also wanted some attention. Also in the Ribbon Reefs is Steve's Mommy. This was one of our favorite dives for schools of beautiful and interesting fish amid great coral. The daytime dive was wonderful, with several of the crew pointing out things that we would have definitely missed. And the night dive was equally as wonderful. It was one of the few night dives that revealed the beauty of night diving. And we saw a turtle.
From the Ribbon Reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, we headed northeast beyond the continental shelf to the Osprey Reef in the North Coral Sea. Osprey Reef was once a mountain that subsided as the ocean level increased after the ice ages. Here you find crystal clear water, steep drop-offs, and pelagic fish from the open Pacific Ocean.
Drift dives along sheer walls are the most popular way of diving many of the coral sea reefs, but were also something that made many of us nervous. Basically, we jumped off in 2 large groups and followed the current. We were on a time limit and then had to surface and swim out from the reef. We signaled the boat for a pickup, whereupon it headed straight for us. We followed one of the sides of the boat in its slipstream, and then had to make a quick grab of the platform rail and belly flop onto the deck. Morality Anchor was our first dive in the Coral Sea. It was considered one of the most pristine dive sites. Our morning dive was one of our guided dives. Monique led us through the swim-through and pointed out the anchor for which the dive site was named.
The Undersea Explorer has been studying sharks at Osprey Reef since 1995. They have taken shark diving to new, unusual, and exciting levels by capturing them underwater during a shark attraction dive, as well as bringing them on board the boat for measurement and tagging. But it was more than just sharks. Between dives, the onboard activities ranged from informative presentations in the biologist's room to nautilus capture, tagging, and talks on the top deck, as well as midweek barbecues under the stars.
North Horn is a dive site at the northern tip of the Osprey Reef where 2 ocean currents converge. This site is famous for its amazing shark dives. For us, these dives featured the white-tipped reef shark and the gray whaler reef shark. Here is where we observed the shark attracts. After we were all down and settled along the reef, they brought down a crate full of fish heads to attract the sharks. Richard, our resident shark wrangler/researcher, would lasso a shark by the tail, wait for it to calm, then place a sensor on it. This sensor measured time and depth. John, our underwater photographer/captain, captured the whole process on film.
The shark capture was also really awesome. We all gathered off the back of the boat while the crew, Richard and Yap mostly, hooked huge pieces of fish onto a chain and threw it into the water to attract the sharks. Oftentimes the shark would rip the pieces off before they could drag the sharks onto the back deck. For a while they couldn't get a shark on the deck, and we started harassing them. John took lots of pictures while we all stood watching. When they brought the shark on the deck, they checked its teeth, measured it, took a tissue sample off its back, and attached a tracking device to its dorsal fin.
The scientists were also doing nautilus research, which was very interesting. The nautilus is one of the oldest known inhabitants of the deep ocean. Wire traps are set at these depths overnight. The captured nautilus are then measured and cataloged while being kept in a small ice water tank during the day. At the end of this fascinating and informative day, every nautilus is gently released into the blue sea to safely return to the bottom with a chilling tale about being abducted and prodded by aliens, and as usual, none of their mates will believe them.
Here are some memorable quotes during our time at sea. "Where's my underwater breathing device?" While it was raining, "Hurry up and get in the water, you'll be drier." And finally, "I know I've been diving too much when I see a shark swimming next to me and I want it to move so I can see something else."
Once we were back on land, many people wanted to get together for a final dinner. Unfortunately, we had already made plans to attend Flames of the Forest. Flames of the Forest is an evening of theater, tropical dining, authentic Aboriginal and Australian culture, explored through storytelling, music, and dance. The next morning, we took a shuttle to the Cairns airport, flew Virgin Blue to Hobart, and the guy at the check-in was wonderful.
Our first stop in our tour in Tasmania with Under Down Under was Mount Wellington. It towered at 4,000 feet over the city of Hobart and promised an inspiring view, but it was not to be. Halfway up the steep mountain, we stopped at the springs and found that the road was closed due to heavy ice and snow. So we had to content ourselves with a quick hike on the Lena Valley track at the springs and then head back on the shuttle to be transported to the Tasman Peninsula.
Our first stop was the Port Arthur Historic Site. It became a prison settlement in 1833 where the worst of the convicts were thrown. It was only connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land called Eaglehawk Neck, which could be cordoned off by ferocious dogs. Otherwise, the land was surrounded by waters that were said to be shark-infested. We did a self-guided tour around the historic site, as well as a cruise on the harbor around the Isle of the Dead.
After Port Arthur, we stopped at several geological wonders in the Tasman Peninsula. Strong southwesterly winds generate pounding waves that attack weaknesses in the rocks and erode the coastline, forming arches, blowholes, bays, beaches, and caves. The first stop was Remarkable Cave. Long ago, the sandstone cave's roof collapsed, and what remains is the long cave tunnel leading to the sea. This is a unique sea cave in that it has two entrances. Both places have eroded along fractures created by ancient earthquakes.
The next stop was the Blowhole, Tasman's Arch, and Devil's Kitchen. They all started as former sea caves and tunnels. The Blowhole is a formation in which the roof at the rear of the tunnel is collapsed to create a broad arch with a blowhole behind it. Over time, it evolves into Tasman's Arch, where the pressure of water and compressed air, sand, and stones act on the vertical cracks in the cliff, thereby dislodging large slabs and boulders. Then the roof collapses and it becomes Devil's Kitchen. The rugged cliffs and sea caves gave us an idea about how much of the coastline of Tasmania is shaped. We ended the day at the Tasman National Park Lookout.
The next morning we got up and had a quick breakfast. Our first stop was at Ross and the Female Factory. The Ross Female Factory, built in the early 1840s, incarcerated female convicts from 1847 to 1854. It was one of 4 female factories established in Tasmania. Then we continued on to Wineglass Bay in Freycinet National Park. In 1999, the travel magazine Outside voted Wineglass Bay one of the top 10 beaches in the world, saying, "This beach on the Tasman Sea forms a half-moon shape so precise it could be the smiley mouth on a Have a Nice Day button." The weather was pretty windy and cold and didn't give the real feeling of being on a beach. It was secluded and I enjoyed getting a beachside view of the Tasman Sea. Time was short since we had another stop to make, so we hiked back up and down and made our way to the shuttle. We didn't want to miss the feeding of the Tasmanian devils and other animals at the wildlife park.
The Tasmanian devils were in enclosed pens and were really a treat to watch. They reminded me of a bear cub on steroids and a really nasty disposition. We were told that they are scavengers and can most often be seen at night along the side of a road feasting on roadkill or on garbage in people's yards. They are ferocious eaters, and we watched a pen of 3 brothers, where the first one was fed and the other 2 took off after him to chase him down for the meat. They were so focused they didn't bother to see if the keeper had more food. They chased each other round and round the pen, and it was the closest we would see to a Tasmanian devil as a whirling dervish. The park was a nature preserve which took in injured and displaced animals and attempted to reintegrate them back into the wild. Kangaroos roamed the park freely and ate the food that was offered to them. We saw other wildlife endemic to Australia and got our closest looks at some of the deadlier creatures Paul had been warned about. With them in a pen and behind glass, Paul wasn't as concerned as he was in the outback.
Another morning of cereal and toast and a new driver. The trip to Cradle Mountain was one of the longer ones, but with his commentary and anecdotes, we seemed to get there in very little time. Cradle Mountain Lake Sinclair National Park is recognized as a wilderness area of outstanding world value. It is one of the few remaining temperate wilderness areas.
We arrived at Cradle Mountain in the early afternoon and took a long hike around Lake Dove. Our guide was an excellent source of information on local species and plant identification. The scenery was phenomenal and the weather was great too. At the end of Lake Dove hike, we had the option to either head back on the bus or take another hike up to Marion's Lookout. We didn't reach the summit, but had some great views along the way.
The next morning we traveled to Montezuma Falls. This was an easy walk along an abandoned railroad track through temperate rainforest to a 341-foot high waterfall. This is one of the highest waterfalls in Tasmania. A single suspension bridge allowed access to the other side. There are also many mine shafts along the way where tin, gold, silver, lead, and zinc were mined from hand-dug adits. Then we continued to the west coast to climb the Henty Dunes, the largest moving dune system in Tasmania. These sand dunes were part of the longest stretch of ocean beach on the planet. They were massive, up to 100 feet high, and they stretched on and on. The dune system is active, constantly being reshaped by the waves, vegetation, and wind. We drove several miles further down this beachfront to another spot where we watched the sunset over the vast ocean. Nothing between us and Argentina. Then we checked into our accommodations for the evening.
After a quick breakfast in the morning, we were on our way to Queenstown, Tasmania. It's the largest town in Tasmania's west coast, a gold mining town where the trees were cut down to fuel smelters and the topsoil was washed away, leaving the odd lunar landscape we see today. Then we stopped at Nelson Falls and took an easy 20-minute hike back to the waterfall. The hike was beautiful and the waterfall was quite spectacular. Then on to a quick stop and hike at the Franklin River, the last wild river left in Tasmania.
Our next stop was lunch at Lake Sinclair. Then one last hike at Mount Field National Park to end our tour of Tasmania. The Tall Trees hike to the Russell Falls and Lady Barron Falls. We then headed back to Hobart, where we went back to our original accommodations. We flew back to the States. After 5 weeks of flying, diving, hiking, drinking, kayaking, backpacking, sailing, drinking, and anyway, we came back. For over a month, we lived the motto of the ECP, we do it all.